Nations premises, property and assets, and the immunity from legal process of the United Nations. Such immunities applies to all UN entities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including UNRWA, a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly. I call on Member States to fully support all of these efforts. Mr. President, in this period of turmoil and transition for the region, Member States must spell out how they will realize the commitment and promise of a two-state solution. This is not a time for ritualistically expressing support, ticking a box and moving on. We are past the stage of ticking boxes. The clock is ticking. The two-state solution is near a point of no return. The international community has a responsibility to prevent perpetual occupation and violence. My call to Member States is clear and urgent. Take irreversible action towards implementing a two-state solution. Do not let extremists on any side undermine what remains of the peace process. The high-level conference in June, co-chaired by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is an important opportunity to revitalize international support. I encourage Member States to go beyond affirmations and to think creatively about the concrete steps they will take to support a viable two-state solution before it is too late. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority needs stepped up and sustained support, politically and financially, and this is crucial to ensure the continued viability of Palestinian institutions, consolidate ongoing reforms, and enable the PA to resume its full responsibilities in Gaza. Mr. President, at this hinge point of history for the people of the Middle East, and on this issue on which so much hinges, leaders must stand and deliver. Show the political courage and exercise the political will to make good on this central question for peace, for Palestinians, Israelis, the region, and humanity. Thank you.
Je remercie le secrétaire général.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement, and I give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. You have the floor.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to express our appreciation for your decision to chair this very important meeting at ministerial level and for the important role France plays on this Council and in support of efforts for peace in our region. I want also to welcome all ministers who are with us today. Allow me further to thank the Secretary General for not allowing the world to look away or forget Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory, reminding them of their obligations and for being a strong voice for humanity and peace. I want also to thank him for being with us today and for his statement, along with the statement of his head of the legal department on behalf of the Secretary General yesterday at The Hague before we presented our opinion. Allow me also to convey our utmost respect for the UN and its heroic personnel on the ground who are risking their lives to save lives. The Security Council has adopted binding resolutions with clear goals: stopping the bloodshed, humanitarian aid reaching those who desperately need it, releasing hostages and detainees, preventing forcible displacement and any attempts at annexation, achieving the two-state solution. The world rallied behind these goals, and yet the reality today is a declared punitive siege by Israel over Gaza to deprive 2 million Palestinians, half of them children, of food and water and medicine and electricity, and all other essentials of life while they endure unbearable, inhumane conditions. There is no shortage of bombs falling on Gaza, but there is an imposed shortage of everything else. Starvation as a weapon of war against an entire civilian population that is still being bombarded relentlessly. Families of hostages and detainees are growing more desperate every day. Their plans for forcible displacement and annexations are well underway, and Israeli leaders no longer feel the need to disguise or hide their nefarious intentions. We cannot surrender to this situation. Let me repeat, we cannot surrender to this situation. We must bring it to an end. An immediate ceasefire must be resumed, and all its objectives must be achieved. President Trump, in his latest conversation with the Israeli Prime Minister, stressed what he called, in his own words, the need to be good to Gaza, given how people there are suffering, and signaling specifically that the United States are pushing to secure the entry of food and medicines to Gaza. We deeply hope that the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, with the support of the international community as a whole, will be able to secure a return to the ceasefire to start bringing all this suffering to an end. Mr. President, there is a way out of this nightmare for everyone's benefit. President Abbas, in his address to the PLO Central Council, made it clear that we want peace. I repeat, we want peace, not only for ourselves, but for all. That we are committed to the rule of international law and want to see it prevail. That we believe that the peaceful approach is the one that can deliver our people's rights, and that there is no justification for harming civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. At the same meeting, the PLO Central Council established the position of Vice President of the PLO and the State of Palestine, held since by Mr. Hussein al-Sheikh. I was supposed to attend the Central Council in Ramallah. Instead, Israel, after holding me up for 5 hours, denied me entry to my own country that I proudly represent here. I am a Palestinian-born in Palestine to Palestinian parents, and I am prohibited from entering my own country. This is a very small part of the collective punishment imposed on all Palestinians, and of the denial of our existence and rights as a nation and as individuals. Mr. President, you have on one side a Palestinian leadership committed to nonviolence, and on the other hand, an Israeli leadership unleashing the worst forms of violence against an entire civilian population. You have a Palestinian leadership that is clearly and unequivocally committed to the two-state solution, and an Israeli leadership decided to its destruction. You have a Palestinian leadership that is showing restraint and acting responsibly, and you have an Israeli leadership whose actions are dictated by its populist and fanatical views. You have a Palestinian leadership committed to international law and aligned with the international consensus, and an Israeli leadership that considers that the rules depend on the identity of the victims and the identity of the perpetrators, demanding impunity for its crimes and considering our very existence a crime. You have a Palestinian leadership that has been responsive to the demands for reforms and an Israeli leadership that has flatly rejected change. You have a Palestinian leadership committed to a simple and yet essential idea: live and let live, and an Israeli leadership that believes that the existence of one people requires the destruction of another. The international community has determined a long time ago that there is not a people too many in the Middle East, but an independent state missing, the independent state of Palestine. Mr. President, there are solutions for those not searching for excuses to prolong the war and unbearable human suffering. There are solutions whereby Hamas would no longer rule Gaza, and transitional governance arrangements would set the stage for the PA to fully assume its responsibilities in the Gaza Strip. There are solutions for the reconstruction of the massive destruction Israel has caused in Gaza without displacing its population. There are solutions for ending this illegal occupation and conflict and ushering an era of shared peace, security, and prosperity. In this regard, Arab countries have displayed leadership that has been commended worldwide. Egypt and Qatar mediating the ceasefire. Arab countries taking the lead when it comes to humanitarian aid through Jordan and Egypt. The responsible roles played by Algeria and the United Arab Emirates in this council over the course of the last 2 years. The Arab Reconstruction Plan, endorsed by the OIC and supported by international partners. The leading role of Saudi Arabia and as chair of the Arab Islamic Committee and as co-chair of the Global Alliance with Norway and the EU, and so-called chair of the June Peace Conference with France. International partners have welcomed, have joined, have contributed to, and have helped advance these initiatives, all seeking just and lasting peace. The international mobilization has never been stronger to confront a reality that has never been darker. We see these mobilizations here in the Council, in the General Assembly, at the International Court of Justice, all determined to uphold international law to end this most painful and historic injustice. As we approach the June conference on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, we call on all states to do all that they can to uphold international law, support our right to self-determination, and salvage peace. We endorse the call of the Secretary General when he said to all of you and those who are outside this room, this is the time for action, not the reiteration of what we agreed to. This is the time for action. We call on those who have yet to do so to recognize the state of Palestine without any further delay, as a clear signal that they will not tolerate its destruction and the destruction of the two-state solution. We believe, Mr. President, that your country in this regard can play a pivotal role. We call on all states to take measures against settlement colonization and against annexation and forcible displacement, and to end Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory in line with the ICJ advisory opinion. We call on all states to support the Palestinian government, which shown clear commitment to reform and peace, and to support politically and financially the Arab Reconstruction Plan, and to continue supporting UNRWA. Mr. President, the Palestinian people are in a cage, killed and starved, day after day after day. As Pope Francis said, this is not war, this is cruelty. Our greatest fear is that the world is growing accustomed to such horrors. That while it condemns Israelis' actions, it feels powerless to stop them. But we ask all countries not to surrender to this self-inflicted powerlessness. Let me repeat. We ask all countries not to surrender to this self-inflicted powerlessness. These atrocities have no moral or legal justifications. This genocide has to end, and life must prevail. The Palestinian people are entitled to international protection for as long as they are trapped under military occupation. A ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, which remains the top priority, should also be accompanied by an end of attacks and repression by Israeli occupation forces and settlers across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which are displacing entire communities. Mr. President, Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered another delusional speech 2 days ago. He insisted once again that the two-state solution meant the destruction of Israel. He said, and I quote, Hamas says we will destroy Israel by terror and military conquest right away, and the PA says, no, you destroy it politically by driving it through propaganda and lawfare to the 67 borders, end of quotation. Pursuing an independent state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in accordance with resolutions of this very council and the very United Nations resolutions in which the state of Israel was established with the partition of Palestine is somehow pursuing the destruction of Israel? Does that make sense? This is nonsense. Those who benefited from the privilege of resolutions of the General Assembly, including the partition plan, and admitted as a member state, are saying us seeking peaceful methods to accomplish the establishment of the independence of the state of Palestine is now the destruction of the state of Israel? Who is among you would buy this nonsense? He spoke of the attempts to annihilate Israel when in reality he is the one pursuing the annihilation of Palestine and its people. He spoke of how the Israeli army moves Palestinian civilians out of harm's way when in reality it has shown total disregard for Palestinian lives, killing and maiming and detaining and torturing and starving them endlessly. He bragged about Israel's violations of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon and Syria, which must be rejected by all. He again asserted that he will pursue peace with regional partners while sidelining the Palestine question as if nothing had happened these last 18 months. He spoke with the same arrogance, the same aversion to facts, and the same disregard for the suffering of people, whether Palestinian or Israelis. Fanatical delusions will destroy our region. We need a strong leadership for peace. I repeat, we need a strong leadership for peace. The deployment of collective resolve at an unprecedented scale that will finally deliver freedom for the Palestinian people. Two states living side by side in peace and security and unleash the true potential of our region for the benefit of all. And we totally agree with you, Mr. Secretary General, when you always say there is no plan B for the two-state solution. We belong resolutely to this camp and count in your collective support to ensure it prevails. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and welcome to the Security Council.
Je remercie l'observateur.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President, Secretary General, Ministers, Excellencies. It is symbolic that this session is taking place on the eve of Israel's Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron. It is the day when we honor the soldiers who gave their lives defending our state and the innocent civilians whose lives were cut short by terror. Israel welcomes what is hopefully to be a broader debate on the Middle East. Far too often, this Council confines its focus to a narrow segment of the region, missing the broader forces at play, both the forces of progress and the forces of destruction. Today we have a chance to widen that lens, and we must. As we speak, the Middle East is in dynamic motion. Danger and opportunity walk side by side. There is much to be hopeful about: economic development, dialogue and collaboration. However, the threats loom imminent, more dangerous than ever. For all the momentum, there are forces seeking to reverse it and take advantage of the instability. And those forces are growing more violent and more entrenched. This is the reality of the Middle East, and we implore the Council and the international community not to ignore or minimize the forces of ruin. This is the reality of terrorism and extremism, of forces present in the Middle East that despise peace and will not rest until their sick version of destruction is fulfilled. There is powerful opportunity in Lebanon today. Public voices, civil society leaders, and elements within its new government are calling for sovereignty, for an end to Hezbollah's tyranny over their country. The Lebanese people have made one thing unmistakably clear: they want peace, stability, and a future free from terror. But Hezbollah, a murderous terrorist organization backed by Iran, continues to hold sway over stockpiles of weapons in civilian areas and is intent on dragging the Lebanese population towards another devastating war. Hezbollah's murderous intent is vividly demonstrated by Hezbollah's ongoing activities. Just 2 days ago, the IDF struck a terrorist infrastructure site in the Dakhya, a Hezbollah stronghold in Beirut, which contained precision missiles intended for use against Israel. The storage of such weaponry within civilian areas constitutes a blatant violation of understandings between Israel and Lebanon and a clear violation of international law. Hezbollah's systematic embedding of missiles amidst the Lebanese population is a cynical exploitation of civilians and another contemptible assault on basic human morality. Prior to the strike, Israel took significant steps to mitigate the risk to uninvolved civilians, including issuing advanced warnings and using precise munitions. Israel will continue to act as necessary to remove threats to its people while taking every possible measure to uphold its obligations under international law. The Lebanese government must have a monopoly on military force. That is the Israeli position. That is the Lebanese position. That is the position of our cessation of hostilities agreement, and it is, of course, the position of this Council per Resolution 1701 and 1559. However, the international support for Lebanese sovereignty and Hezbollah's disarmament must be more than rhetorical. The implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement on the Lebanese side remains partial, with many of the violations reported to the US-led mechanisms remaining unaddressed. The international community must take tangible steps to assist the Lebanese government and armed forces in reclaiming its sovereignty and dismantling Hezbollah's parallel army of terrorists. We cannot waste another decade standing by as Hezbollah regains its strengths and further entrenches itself in Lebanon. Syria today is a country no longer under the Assad regime, but not yet under stable governance. The collapse of the Assad regime created a volatile void. The armed military militias roam unchecked, Iranian-backed forces operate with impunity, radical groups, some aligned with the most brutal global terror networks, control territory and populations. As is too often the case in times of collapse, Syria's most vulnerable, its minorities, its internally displaced, its religious and ethnic communities are the ones left exposed. Christians, Druze, Kurds, Yazidis are all caught between a shattered state and roaming militias. Moreover, we cannot ignore the deeply troubling pattern emerging in Syria, where individuals with jihadist backgrounds have been appointed to key positions within the provisional government and its affiliated armed groups. These individuals, many of whom were previously aligned with terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Jabhat al-Nusra, now hold command over military infrastructure that could be used to destabilize the region and threaten the security of neighboring states, including Israel. These groups' ideologies are clear and cause for serious alarm. This threat was evident last month in the brutal massacre and abuse of Alawite civilians and other vulnerable populations. The Syrian people deserve better. They deserve a future not dominated by sectarianism and foreign interference. They deserve international support that empowers local stability, not the enabling of jihadism and chaos. This Council must recognize the urgency of the situation. Syria must not become a permanently fractured state governed by guns, but by the rule of law. The region cannot afford it, and the Syrian people can no longer endure it. Mr. President, as we look across the region, there is one thread connecting the instability. It is the same thread connected to the Houthi missiles which are relentlessly fired at Israel population centers. It is the same thread connected to Hamas's massacre of our people on October 7th. Iran is not a lowly agitator. It is the engineer of our region's turmoil. Through Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen, Iran has constructed a deliberate network of violence to expand its reach and destabilize its enemies. This is active, ongoing, and strategic. And above all, Iran continues to advance its nuclear ambitions. It issues existential threats openly and regularly. Israel will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. We will not waver. We will not retreat on this issue, and we call on the international community to uphold that red line, because the consequences of a nuclear Iran will not be limited to Israel. They will extend across this region and beyond. The international community can no longer afford to abdicate its responsibility when it comes to Iran. The chaos Tehran has released across the region is a result of years of hesitation and indulgence. Its accelerating nuclear program now poses an even graver threat. It is time to confront the reality that unchecked Iranian aggression will not recede on its own. It must be confronted decisively and collectively. Iran's fingerprints are, of course, on the situation in Gaza, where its proxy Hamas has brought only ruin to its people and terror to ours. I remind the Council that Israel did not seek this war. It was forced upon us on October 7th, when Hamas committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Over 1,200 murdered, entire families, babies, children, mothers, grandparents wiped out. 251 hostages were taken into Gaza. Today, 59 of those innocent people remain, with 24 believed to be alive. 35 more are believed to be dead, their bodies still inhumanely held. Hamas has rejected every reasonable offer for their return home. Instead, it releases horrifying footage of hostages to deepen the agony of their families and to prolong their torment. This is sadism. It is psychological warfare in the vilest degree imaginable. Israel has a duty to its people and to the world to dismantle Hamas's military and governing infrastructure, to ensure Gaza can never again be used as a launchpad for atrocities, and first and foremost, to bring our hostages home. However, that duty has never come at the cost of our international obligations. Allow me to remind the Council that Article 70 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions requires aid where the civilian population is not adequately supplied. During the 42-day ceasefire, more than 25,000 aid trucks entered Gaza, facilitated by Israel. These trucks carried tens of thousands of tons of humanitarian aid, including food, fuel, and medical supplies. Israel is closely monitoring the situation and coordinating with relevant UN agencies and humanitarian organizations on the ground. Our assessments indicate there is currently no evidence of a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Further, under Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, a party is not obliged to allow in aid that is likely to support the enemy's military effort. And yet, this is exactly what Hamas has done, stealing aid from the civilian population and selling supplies to rebuild the terror machine. Still, some in the international community continue to draw dangerous false equivalencies, ignoring that Hamas alone began this war, continuing to prolong it, and still holds 59 hostages underground in inhumane conditions. 59 hostages who have never received an ounce of humanitarian aid. As Eli Sharabi recently testified before this Council, he personally witnessed Hamas terrorists bringing UN humanitarian aid into their tunnels where they consumed it themselves, denying even the smallest share to the starving hostages. This war can end tomorrow if Hamas releases the hostages and lays down its weapons. That is the only path to peace. That is why the convening of the high-level international conference on the conflict in June is destined, unfortunately, to fail. Such an initiative is disconnected from the current reality and risks doing more harm than good, particularly in the post-October 7th environment. It creates false expectations while ignoring the underlying dysfunction of the Palestinian Authority, its ongoing support for terrorism via the pay-for-slave program, its refusal to implement long overdue reforms, its promotion of incitement, and its legal warfare against Israel in international forum. Yet this conference provides fertile ground for yet another opportunity to politicize and polarize international forums, deepening the divide and moving all parties further from peace. Genuine progress will not come from internationalizing the conflict or from one-sided measures decided by uninvolved parties. It will come from responsible leadership, the rejection of terrorism, and embracing the moderate parties. Efforts to promote this conference undermine the path towards real regional progress. Instead of amplifying failed approaches, the international community should focus its energy where it is most needed, confronting the radical axis led by Iran and its terror proxies. Esteemed Council members, there is a danger in mistaking aspiration for reality. This Council must not fall into the trap of wishful thinking. We cannot speak of reconstruction without security. We cannot achieve Lebanese sovereignty while tolerating Hezbollah. We cannot promote regional cooperation while ignoring Iran's nuclear aspirations. And one cannot claim to stand for peace while legitimizing the forces that slaughtered families in their homes. There is tremendous opportunity in the Middle East today, but the greatest threat to that opportunity is terrorism, fanaticism, and an apparent international blindness to them. If we are serious about building a better future for the region, then we must also be serious about naming the obstacles in the way. Israel is ready. We are ready to work with regional partners, ready to deepen cooperation, but we will not compromise on the security of our people, and we will not accept the permanence of terror. This Council has a chance to support progress, to back governments that seek reform, to empower voices that reject extremism, to stand with those who value life and prosperity, not death and misery. It is not too late, but the window will not stay open forever. Through a realistic acceptance of the challenging reality in the Middle East, it might be possible to summon the resolve to harness the potential for an improved future for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Monsieur le Secrétaire Général,
Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I decided to make the debate on the Middle East a landmark event of the French presidency of the Security Council. The anti-Semitic massacres of the 7th of October 2023 and the military response that ensued have shaken the region. Right now, Gaza is devastated by war. Lebanon is struggling to get back on its feet. Syria is engaging in a fragile and uncertain transition. And Iran is pursuing its dangerous nuclear arms race. This spiral of destabilization must not lead us into a situation from which we cannot turn back. This is why we need to strive together for peace and security for all. Our first priority is to stop the hostilities, to bring an end to civilian suffering. In Lebanon, in close cooperation with our American partners, 5 months ago, we managed to achieve a ceasefire agreement. Its implementation still has room for improvement, but it did bring peace. It is crucial for it to be maintained. In Gaza, unfortunately, war continues. The ceasefire being broken and the resumption of Israeli strikes must shock us. They are a dramatic step back for the Palestinian civilians, for Israeli hostages and their families, and for the security of the whole region. There is an urgent need for negotiations to resume and to achieve a lasting ceasefire. We support the mediators' efforts to achieve this. This ceasefire must enable the unconditional and immediate release of all hostages arbitrarily detained by Hamas. I would like, here speaking to this council, to pay particular attention to our compatriot Ofer Calderon, released after 484 days in captivity. I'd also like to pay a tribute to our compatriot Ohad Yaloumi, abducted on the 7th of October, who was arbitrarily detained and then killed in Gaza. He leaves a widow and 3 innocent children behind. The ceasefire should also ensure the mass entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza. The situation on the ground is catastrophic. However, for 2 months now, all humanitarian aid has been blocked. I went to the Egyptian border, and I can testify to you with my own eyes that this situation is unacceptable. Since the end of March, the Israeli bombings have killed more than 1,300 people, including numerous civilians, women, and children. These strikes have also killed humanitarian workers and UN staff. The living hell that the Gazan civilians are in must stop. I would call upon Israel to lift all restrictions so that humanitarian aid can enter Gaza, and in huge volumes. France has fully mobilized to respond to the humanitarian emergency. Since 2023, we've provided 250 million euros in humanitarian aid to civilians. Part of this aid was distributed through UNRWA. France supports its actions, but also supports the reform underway. In close cooperation with our regional partners, in particular Egypt and Jordan, we've also directly provided healthcare, food, and shelter for the Gazan inhabitants who are victims of the war. Our second priority is to help the territories terrorized by conflicts to rebuild. The International Conference in support of the people and sovereignty of Lebanon that was held in Paris on the 24th of October 2024 collected more than $1 billion. This assistance is for the population and for the security forces. The new authorities have undertaken reforms and reconstruction efforts, and we support this. We will also host in Paris an international conference to support Lebanon's economic recovery. The role of the UN throughout this process of reconstruction is crucial. Lebanon must regain its sovereignty, its complete sovereignty. We would call upon those Israeli forces that are still present to withdraw from Lebanese territory so that the Lebanese armed forces can deploy there once again. It's up to them to ensure the security and sovereignty of the state, assisted by UNIFIL and the oversight mechanism that France is involved in alongside the US, and which includes the UN. France will continue its efforts with determination to ensure the full implementation of Resolution 1701 of this Council. In Syria, a historic transition process has been underway since the toppling of the dictator Bashar al-Assad. France is prepared to lend its support here. Along with its European partners, France initiated the conditional lifting of sanctions. The transition process must be respected and protected, as should all rights of all Syrian men and women, irrespective of their ethnic, religious, or gender affiliation. There should also be the pursuit of effective and decisive fighting terrorism, and I will say this once again from the podium of the General Assembly of the United Nations. The atrocious crimes committed by Bashar al-Assad's regime must not be forgotten. The UN has an important role to play against impunity and to rebuild Syria. In Gaza, we support the efforts of our Arab partners to build a robust and credible framework for the day after. This framework should enable reconstruction, governance, and security in the Strip. However, these efforts can only be effective if they're part of a political solution. This is why our third priority is to work to attain political solutions that can guarantee a just and lasting peace. There's only one solution that can achieve a political settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the two-state solution, the only one that can guarantee peace and security in the long term for Israelis and Palestinians. This solution has currently been undermined by the heightened settlement activity in the West Bank and by violence by extremist settlers and by the desire to weaken the Palestinian Authority and by talk of an annexation and forced population displacement. Given the facts on the ground, the prospect of a Palestinian state, that prospect needs to be protected. That is why, along with Saudi Arabia, France will organize in June here in New York an international conference on the implementation of the two-state solution. Our objective is clear: to make progress on the recognition of Palestine and the normalization of relations with Israel at the same time. This is how we will be able to guarantee Israel's security and its regional integration, whilst responding to the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians to have their own state. This roadmap for the effective implementation of the two-state solution also involves disarming Hamas, defining a credible government structure from which it will be excluded, and the reform of the Palestinian Authority. The UN and its agencies must play their full role in this process. In parallel, we spare no effort to find a diplomatic solution to the challenge of the relentless pursuit of the Iranian nuclear program. The director of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, described this very clearly yesterday during our meeting on non-proliferation. Given destabilizing interference from outside, we will continue to strive to strengthen the sovereignty of the states of the region. I have just returned from a trip to Iraq, and I'd like to underscore how this country paves the way. Torn apart not long ago by conflict and power games, today it's managing to keep to the side of regional tensions. Iraq has regained its role as a center of equilibrium and stability. The third conference of Baghdad that will take place at the end of the year attests to this. It will enable us to work on cooperation and regional security, counteracting the logic of fragmentation and confrontation that is at play today. Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, France seeks to serve peace and sovereignty, without which nothing is possible. We are firmly committed through our history and our geography to the Near and Middle East. Today, our security and our stability all depend on this region, that of all of us. We are therefore determined to pave with you, for you, the path of peace. I now resume my functions as President of the Council, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Alaji Timothy Musa Kaba, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Sierra Leone. You have the floor.
I thank Mr. President, Excellency Mr. Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. I thank you for convening this important ministerial level debate. And I also thank the Secretary General for his briefing and unwavering leadership in seeking peace in the Middle East under deeply challenging conditions. This meeting comes at a moment of grave urgency. The prolonged Israel-Palestine conflict continues to inflict devastating humanitarian, security, and political consequences, destabilizing the region and challenging the collective conscience of the international community. The recent and continued violations of ceasefire agreement have worsened an already catastrophic humanitarian situation. In the Gaza Strip and West Bank, we are witnessing an alarming deterioration characterized by mass civilian casualties, repeated displacement, and widespread destruction of infrastructure, an affront to international humanitarian law and the rules-based international system. Reports indicate that 1,890 people were killed between 18 March and 17 April, including 595 children. Indiscriminate airstrikes on densely populated areas and IDP camps have resulted in appalling civilian casualties. The use of incendiary weapons in these attacks has left women and children burnt alive in their shelters, deepening trauma and collective despair. Repeated evacuation orders have displaced over 480,000 people within a matter of weeks. The total blockade of humanitarian aid and commercial goods since 2nd March 2025 is a man-made catastrophe. Despite the presence of food convoys by UNRWA and the World Food Programme WFP, access remains blocked. WFP's recent warning of depleted food reserves and the possible suspension of operations is a dire signal. Medical facilities already overburdened and under-equipped face collapse. Fuel, medicine, clean water, and electricity are almost non-existent. Humanitarian personnel operate under immense risk. Dozens have been killed, while UNRWA, a lifeline for millions of Palestinians, faces obstruction, politicization, and underfunding. The legal obligations of the occupying power are clear under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel, as the occupying power, is bound to ensure the welfare of civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory, including access to food, water, shelter, and medical care. These obligations are not discretionary. In this regard, Sierra Leone strongly supports the submission of the United Nations to the International Court of Justice, which reaffirmed Israel's continuing legal obligations toward the United Nations, UNRWA, and the people under occupation. The UN's legal position is unambiguous. Israel cannot derogate from its responsibilities under international law and must allow unhindered humanitarian access. Mr. President, the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is equally concerning. Settlement expansion, the demolition of homes, and restrictions of Palestinian movement continue to intensify. Thousands remain displaced in Jenin, Tulkarm, and other communities. These actions risk undermining the path toward a two-state solution and must cease. Sierra Leone underscores the urgent need for accountability and compliance with international humanitarian law. Despite the non-convening of a conference of high contracting parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention with the aim of reaffirming legal protections, accessing compliance, and advancing mechanisms for accountability, Sierra Leone continues to urge for compliance with IHL and a constant reaffirmation of its principles. As a country that emerged from conflict through multilateral solidarity and principled diplomacy over 2 decades, Sierra Leone believes in peace through lawful and negotiated settlement, not through violence or collective punishment. In this regard, we emphasize the following priorities. First, improving the security situation. We unequivocally condemn the targeting of civilians, hostage-taking, and all forms of attacks on non-combatants. We reiterated our call for the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining 59 Israeli hostages held by Hamas and urge all parties to commit to a renewed cessation of hostilities. Security Council Resolution 2735/2024 provides a foundation for dialogue. Second, ensuring humanitarian access. Humanitarian assistance must not be politicized or weaponized. We call for the safe, sustained, and unimpeded access for aid agencies across all border entry points into Gaza, including the Rafah, Kerem Shalom, and Erez crossings. We reject restrictions placed on UNRWA and other aid organizations and support full resumption of their work. The international community must urgently act to avert a famine and allow the continuation of critical health interventions, such as the forthcoming round of polio vaccinations. Third, Mr. President, supporting a renewed peace process. The current cycle of violence and once again proves that occupation, blockade, and unilateral actions cannot form the basis for peace. We welcome the initiative by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to co-chair an international conference on the Middle East peace process and call on all parties to approach the process in good faith. This effort must be anchored in international law, relevant UN resolutions, and long-standing frameworks such as the Arab Peace Initiative and the Quartet Principles. Sierra Leone continues to support the internationally endorsed vision of 2 states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, with East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state, and a return to the 1967 borders. We reaffirm our call for the full implementation of all relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, and we encourage intensified diplomatic engagement by regional and international actors. In closing, Mr. President, Sierra Leone joins others in renewing our collective call for peace, justice, and accountability. The road to peace must be paved with respect for international law, humanitarian principles, and the inherent dignity of every human being in the region, in particularly the people of Israel and Palestine. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kaba for his statement, and I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Barbara Zvogelj, Secretary General, Minister for Foreign Affairs and European Affairs of Slovenia.
I thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to everyone. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you, Secretary General, on behalf of my government, for the service of each and every UN staff member on the ground. Mr. President, 7th October was the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. And what followed are the deadliest 570 days ever for Palestinians. We have never seen such a perpetuating trauma for people on the ground, nor an obliteration of the system we had built to prevent it. Mr. President, never has humanity been more suffocated. From attacks on humanitarian, medical, and media workers, to attacks on civilians and destruction of civilian objects and humanitarian facilities in Gaza. From the longest blockade of humanitarian aid since the start of the war, now passing 50 days, to plans for militarization of aid. From limiting access of humanitarian workers to downright attempts to dismantle a UN agency, to legally prosecute it and discredit the entire organization. From killing civilians just because they are of certain ethnic background, to taking others for hostage for the same reason. The list of the unacceptable is long, and it prevents us from shielding civilians from a war which they bear no responsibility for. We again call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, never has the future of the region seemed so profoundly uncertain. To use the words of Gazan photographer Fatima Haswana, tragically killed earlier this month, every death will have an impact that will remain through time. There is no military solution to the Palestinian question. War in Gaza does not bring more security to Israel. Operations in the West Bank and persistent illegal occupation and settlement expansion are shaking up the entire region. Attacks across the region, including on the south of Syria, along with inflammatory political narratives, are stoking global instability. As a diplomat, I fear what could come out of the ashes of the Gaza war if there is no united front from the international community to prevent more violence, more hatred, and more radicalism. As a mother, I wonder what kind of future awaits those children in Palestine who have lost their entire families, or those children in Israel whose relatives are still held hostage or will never come home. The road to their recovery is long. It is our responsibility to pave it with peace. Mr. President, never have needed more strength to prevent the evaporation of a political solution and to defend the system we have collectively built. Slovenia has long been a staunch supporter of the two-state solution. Last June, we recognized the State of Palestine. Since October 2023, we have been providing humanitarian aid to address the needs of civilian population in Gaza. For almost 15 years, we have been carrying out the medical rehabilitation of wounded Palestinian children in Slovenia. We will continue speaking in favor of Israel's security, as well as in support of the work of the Palestine Authority, including in their reform path. We stand against any territorial or demographic change of Palestine. Slovenia supports the ongoing discussions around the comprehensive Gaza reconstruction plan, highlighting the crucial role of strong Arab and Palestinian ownership. We will continue supporting political and legal processes. Everyone should play their part, including through tangible commitments and actions at the International Conference on the Two-State Solution this June that you just mentioned, Mr. President. As we look to the future, our first, most immediate priority must be a lasting ceasefire followed by reconstruction. But the future must also include an honest reflection on the failures, our failures, to uphold the security net that the international community should provide to prevent such devastation. Mr. President, with the level of suffering we see, immense wisdom and courage are needed to ensure respect of international law, to overcome divisions, and to safeguard the two-state solution. We have said never again a long time ago. We must now make sure to keep our word. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Zvokec, and I give the floor to His Excellency Lord Ray Collins of Highbury, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. You have the floor.
President, the Secretary-General has highlighted the appalling situation in Gaza. The human cost on October the 7th was horrific, and since that day, hostages have endured unimaginable cruelty and Palestinians have faced relentless death and destruction. We welcome President Abbas's call for the hostages to be released, and we echo that call. We also need a return to the ceasefire to end the terrible bloodshed. We are deeply concerned by the World Food Programme's announcement on Friday that its food stocks in Gaza have run out. It is unacceptable that Israel has blocked humanitarian support from entering Gaza for nearly 2 months, meaning that Palestinian civilians, including 1 million children, are facing starvation, disease, and death. UN and other workers must be able to deliver life-saving assistance safely and in line with humanitarian principles. We are outraged by recent attacks, including the killing of Palestinian Red Crescent workers and the hit on a UN compound on the 19th of March. Israel has admitted that this was caused by one of their tanks, despite the compound being known to the IDF as a UN humanitarian facility. This is inexcusable. We urge Israel to ensure accurate public statements on such grave incidents. It must conduct full and transparent investigations into these incidents, hold those responsible to account, and reinstate an effective deconfliction system to prevent such tragedies. President, the United Kingdom believes that lasting peace and security can only be achieved through a two-state solution. And we thank France and Saudi Arabia for their leadership in preparing for the conference in June. We should build on the Arab plan for the Gaza's future and develop credible security and governance plans acceptable to both Israel and Palestinians. Hamas must no longer govern Gaza or pose a threat to Israel, and we should build the capability of the Palestinian Authority, which will be central to a future state. Finally, we must seize the opportunity to build lasting peace across the region. There has been important progress in Lebanon, where the government has committed to crucial reforms, and in Syria, with moves towards an inclusive political transition. The United Kingdom will continue to support the Lebanese and Syrian people to build on this momentum, and we urge all parties to avoid destabilising actions and abide by their international obligations. President, a better future in the Middle East is possible. To realise it, we must return to a ceasefire in Gaza, reinvest in efforts to achieve a two-state solution, and pursue wider normalization of relationships for the benefit of Palestinians, Israelis, and all those living in the region. I thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency Lord Collins for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I welcome you, Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot. Thank you to Secretary General Guterres for your briefing. Colleagues, as we have consistently said, the future of the Middle East must look different. Fresh thinking is needed to bring about a durable peace and prosperity that provides opportunities for all the region's people. Mr. President, with respect to the humanitarian needs in Gaza, no one wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry or thirsty. A ceasefire agreement would create the condition for the flow of humanitarian aid, but Hamas is preventing this agreement from being concluded. Just 2 weeks ago, Hamas rejected yet another proposal put forward by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt that would release hostages who have been held for 570 days and bring calm to Gaza. Instead, Hamas, a brutal terrorist organization, continues to violently suppress organic protests against its barbaric rule and demonstrate its lack of regard for the Palestinian civilians it purports to represent. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war it unleashed on October 7, 2023, when it committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and abducted more than 250 hostages, as well as for the resumption of hostilities in March following Hamas's rejection of multiple proposals. The United States supports Israel in its fight to defend itself from groups that wish to destroy it. Fighting could end tomorrow if Hamas released hostages and laid down its arms. Their reckless decisions have caused enough bloodshed. Hamas must leave Gaza forever. The Council should apply pressure on Hamas to, for the first time, free Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas's tyranny. Shielding Hamas from accountability only undermines Israel's security and does nothing to improve the lives of Palestinians. Mr. President, this Council has heard firsthand testimony from Noah Argamani and Eli Sharabi, who bravely detailed the depravity they experienced at the hands of their Hamas captors. We cannot remain silent about the horrors of their plight or the urgent need to press for the release of the 59 hostages who remain in Hamas's grip, including those brutally murdered in Hamas captivity. Mr. President, President Trump has been clear. Hamas must release all the hostages immediately. 5 Americans still need to come home. Idan Alexander can still return to his parents' arms, but Hamas continues to hold the bodies of Itai Chen, Gadi Hagei, Judy Weinstein Hagei, and Omer Nutra. We will not rest until every hostage has been returned from Gaza. They will not be left behind. They will never be forgotten. We recognize the IDF's ongoing efforts to prevent civilian harm in Gaza, including its review of the tragic March 23rd incident that claimed the lives of humanitarian workers. We take note that the IDF claims 6 members of Hamas were among those killed in this incident and call on the UN and member states to demand Hamas stop its abhorrent practice of putting civilians in harm's way. Hamas continues to cynically use civilian infrastructure to shield their personnel and weaponry. We expect all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. President, turning to the wider region, we must also recognize the insidious violence, suffering, and instability throughout the Middle East that Iran promotes through its malign actions, including its sponsorship of terrorism. Through Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and countless other terrorist proxies it backs, Iran poses a threat to the millions of people who call this region home. Iran's nuclear program, another cornerstone of its global campaign for destabilization, also threatens not only the safety of the international community, but its own citizens. President Trump has been clear. There are two paths for Iran to end its nuclear program. The United States prefers a negotiated resolution. Time, however, is limited. If Iran refuses to abandon its nuclear weapons program, we must hold it accountable. But real, meaningful diplomacy remains within reach. The United States will do its part to help forge a new reality alongside Israel and our Arab partners. The future must start in Gaza without Hamas. Meetings or international conferences will not change this reality. Hamas must disarm and be removed from Gaza, and the hostages must be returned home. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I would like to thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank you for coming to New York to preside over this meeting. Thank you to Secretary General Guterres for your briefing. The Middle East is now deeply mired in turmoil. The tensions on the ground are worrying. Israel has reignited the war in Gaza. Its ongoing siege and relentless attacks on Gaza have resulted in new casualties among innocent civilians on a daily basis and an escalating humanitarian catastrophe. The illegal settlements in the West Bank keep expanding. Settler violence is intensifying. Israel's repeated attacks on Lebanon and Syria are violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of both countries on an ongoing basis. Since last month, tensions have been on the rise in the Red Sea. The United States has been ramping up airstrikes on Yemen in violation of Yemen's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Gaza conflict is the trigger of the current round of regional volatility. 19 months have passed since the outbreak of the conflict, despite the unanimous and strong call from the international community for a ceasefire and an end to the war in Gaza. Peace remains elusive. Amid the mayhem, over 52,000 people have lost their lives. 2 million people in Gaza are threatened with forced displacement. The current round of the Gaza conflict has lasted for so long, with so much devastation. A major reason for this is the wanton violation of the basic norms underpinning international rule of law. Here, I wish to reiterate some self-evident principles. Security Council resolutions must be fully implemented. This is stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations. There is no room for distortion in interpretation. Abiding by international humanitarian law is a non-negotiable obligation and must not be used as a bargaining chip. The principles of international law are universally applicable to all countries. Double standard and selective application entail serious consequences. We urge Israel to fulfill its international legal obligations in earnest and observe the basic norms governing international relations. The United States, a country with major influence on the party concerned, should cast aside its geopolitical self-interests, uphold a fair and responsible attitude, and work to restore peace and stability in the region. Given the gravity of the situation, I wish to emphasize the following points. First, a lasting ceasefire must be secured. Violence or force cannot bring about security. A lasting ceasefire in Gaza is the best way to save lives and bring hostages home. This must be an overriding priority. China urges Israel to relinquish its obsession with the delusion of winning by force and to immediately cease its military operations in Gaza and its attacks on Lebanon and Syria. We call on the U.S. to stop its airstrikes on Yemen and to respect Yemen's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. The Houthis should stop harassing merchant ships and should maintain the safety of shipping lanes in the Red Sea. Second, humanitarian aid in Gaza must be restored. Humanitarian aid must not be weaponized. Israel must fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law as the occupying power by immediately lifting the blockade and fully restoring humanitarian access to Gaza. We strongly condemn any attacks against humanitarian workers and call for thorough investigations and accountability for all attacks. These so-called professional failures must not be used as an excuse to kill humanitarian workers. UNRWA, a body established upon a mandate of a UNGA resolution, enjoys privileges and immunities. Its dignity, safety and security and facility should be respected and guaranteed. Third, unilateral actions that violate international law must stop. Settlement activities in the West Bank violate Security Council resolutions and must cease immediately. Security Council Resolution 2735 made it clear that, I quote, it rejects any attempt at the demographic and territorial change in the Gaza Strip. The recent expansion of the Israeli military presence in Gaza, carving out more than half of the territory into a buffer zone, is a cause for serious concern. The international community must firmly oppose any forcible displacement of the population of Gaza and any attempts to annex territory in Gaza or the West Bank. Israel should withdraw from the Lebanese and Syrian territories without delay. Fourth, the two-state solution must be revitalized. Implementing the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. We support the Gaza Recovery and Reconstruction Plan jointly launched by Egypt and other Arab countries. We commend France and Saudi Arabia for convening the upcoming high-level conference on the two-state solution in June and hope that the conference will inject new impetus to the implementation of the two-state solution. The international community should step up its efforts to promote the political process of a two-state solution and provide it with robust guarantees. President, as the primary organ for maintaining international peace and security, the Security Council has the responsibility to take all necessary steps towards a lasting ceasefire in Gaza. China will continue to work with the international community in an unremitting effort to end the war in Gaza, restore peace in the Middle East, and achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I extend my gratitude to the French presidency for convening this meeting at such a critical juncture as the Palestinian people and the broader region face unprecedented challenges. Our sincere appreciation also goes to the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his briefing illuminating the devastating scale of the suffering in Gaza. We meet again amid a profound moral crisis where international resolve has diminished to mere expressions of sympathy about the catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. The statistics speak volumes. In 18 months, over 50,000 Palestinians killed, more than 100,000 wounded in these relentless atrocities. Occupied Palestinian territory situation is rapidly deteriorating beyond our darkest fears. The systematic deprivation of millions of Gazans is evident in the World Food Programme depleted stocks and acute shortages of medicine, fuel, and clean water. Most devastating of all is UNRWA, the sole lifeline sustaining Palestinian refugees for more than 7 decades, has been systematically dismantled, leaving an unprecedented void in humanitarian assistance. For over 50 days, Gaza has been transformed into an open-air prison where survival itself has become a daily struggle. The deliberate targeting of medical facilities, obstruction of aid, and forced starvation of civilians constitute crimes against humanity that demand immediate action. More alarming still is the forced displacement of 2 million Palestinians, 90% of Gaza's population, while 20,000 new settlement units rise in the occupied West Bank, revealing a calculated strategy to permanently alter Palestinian demographics. Mr. President, in response to these developments, my delegation proposes the following points. An immediate and permanent ceasefire must take effect. While we acknowledge the promising negotiations in Cairo, we emphasize that dialogue must yield tangible results. Humanitarian access to Gaza must flow without restriction. We cannot observe passively as basic survival becomes a luxury for an entire population. Protection mechanisms for civilian infrastructure, particularly hospitals, schools, and religious sites, must be established and enforced. The International Court of Justice ruling must be implemented, ensuring accountability through international justice mechanism. Mr. President, Somalia stands firmly behind the Arab Islamic plan for Gaza's early recovery and reconstruction. We view the upcoming high-level international conference co-chaired by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as vital to implementing a viable two-state solution. We advocate for Palestine's full membership in the United Nations as a recognition of a long-denied fundamental right and the only path aligned with international law and UN resolutions. Yet this solution grows more distant with each day of occupation, each new settlement, each demolished home. Mr. President, beyond Palestine, we are concerned about Israel's continued aggression in Lebanon and its violation of its sovereignty, including airstrikes and presence in the authorized buffer zones. We call for immediate Israeli withdrawal from the Lebanese territory and uphold its obligation under UN Security Council Resolution 1701 of 2006. In Syria, we denounce the repeated Israeli airstrikes on civilian infrastructure, airport, and airstrips. These actions not only violate international law, but breached the 1974 disengagement of force agreement between Israel and Syria, threatening regional stability. In conclusion, Mr. President, our delegation reiterates its unwavering position. We must revitalize the political track towards a comprehensive peace, recognizing the state of Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital as the only viable path forward. The choice before this Council is stark. We can either perpetuate a cycle of crisis management, or we can summon the political courage to pursue a lasting and just solution. The stability of our region and the credibility of this Council depends on it. Somalia stands ready to support all genuine efforts toward this end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you for being with us today to attend this very important debate that you're presiding over.
Peace cannot be achieved through violence. It can only be attained through understanding and negotiations. Yet, a political understanding of the Palestinian question remains elusive, as we are only 1 month away from the upcoming June conference and the prospects of a ceasefire deal are still unclear. The June conference presents a unique opportunity to revitalize the political process and pave the way towards the implementation of the two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolutions, while recognizing the right of Israel to exist side by side with the Palestinians in peace. We support the efforts by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and sincerely thank them for their work and their leadership in promoting a sustainable day after for the region. Having said that, we cannot but stress the importance for the fruition of the negotiations with the aim of achieving a permanent sustainable ceasefire while securing the release of all hostages. We commend the mediators, Egypt, Qatar and the United States for their tireless efforts. Undoubtedly, a peaceful future in the Middle East cannot be established through violence,
and the forced displacement of people. It is also clear that Hamas cannot have any future in Gaza. The way towards peace should be based on international law while ensuring the leading role of a reformed Palestinian Authority, being the only credible and moderate alternative with the assistance of the international community. The European Union has exercised critical leadership in this regard by announcing a 1.8 billion support package for the Palestinians. We also commend the PA's readiness to continue its ambitious reform agenda. Likewise, the Arab Plan for Gaza, as presented by Egypt, is a constructive proposal. Greece supports this initiative as a good starting point towards planning reconstructions, and we reiterate that Hamas should have no role in the day after, as it continues to be a serious obstacle for sustainable peace. On the humanitarian front, the ongoing hostilities in the Gaza Strip has led to a significant increase of the death toll, leaving behind hundreds of Palestinians dead, thousands wounded, and internally displaced, all in acute need of food, water, medical supplies, and shelter. At the same time, the hostages and their families continue to live in a daily agony and uncertainty. Greece has repeatedly condemned the October 7 terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and the cruel treatment of the hostages who remain in Hamas captivities. All hostages must be treated humanely and immediately and unconditionally released. It is evident that the humanitarian blockade further deprives people of the means for survival. The unhindered continuous flow of aid at scale into all parts of Gaza, combined with the restoration of the water and electricity systems, constitutes a priority. At the same time, humanitarian workers, medical staff, and patients must be protected at all times in accordance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the humanitarian security landscape in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories remains alarming. We are deeply concerned by the closure orders issued by the Israeli authorities against UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem, a decision which threatens the fundamental right of education of hundreds of pupils. UNRWA's role remains pivotal and indispensable. Turning to the West Bank, Greece expresses concern over the increase of settlement activity, the displacements of people from refugee camps, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned properties, as well as the restricted access of aid groups to refugee camps. The special status quo of Jerusalem and its old city is of particular importance. It must be protected and respected by all and at all times. Its sacred spaces should remain inviolable. All of its communities should enjoy viability. Last but not least, Jordan's special role as custodian of massive and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem must be preserved, as it actively and beneficially contributes to preserving multiculturalism and religious tolerance in the region. Mr. President, in Lebanon, the formation of a new government presents a unique opportunity to restore stability. The new government has demonstrated its readiness to promote essential reforms and finally turn the page for Lebanese to find a new opportunity for peace and prosperity for the benefits of the whole region. This was clearly demonstrated in the recent quadrilateral meeting of the leaders of Greece, France, Cyprus, and Lebanon the past month. Forging strong state institutions, including the Lebanese armed forces, which play a crucial role in the implementation of the ceasefire agreement, is very important. We stand ready to assist the LAF, as the Greek Minister of Defense underscored during his recent visit to Beirut earlier this month. We strongly reaffirm our support for the relevant Security Council resolution and the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of Lebanon, as mentioned in Security Council Presidential Statement of January 15. UNIFIL is key for the restoration of peace and security, and thus Greece will be actively engaged in the discussion of the renewal of its mandate this summer. Mr. President, it has only been a few days since our last meeting in this chamber on the situation in Syria in the presence of Syrian interim foreign minister. As Special Envoy Peterson noted, the political transition in Syria is now at a truly critical juncture. This transition needs to be fully inclusive, Syrian-led and owned, according to the principle of Security Council Resolution 2554, as justice, accountability, and respect for international law, including the law of the sea, remains critical. A stable and prosperous Syria is key for the future of the Middle East. In concluding, Mr. President, hope should prevail over violence. The cycle of violence that started on October 7 must finally come to an end so as to open the path for a vision of regional integration and prosperity which would bring concrete benefits to all peoples in the region. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Greece. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Your Excellency, Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, thank you for convening this high-level open debate. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his sobering briefing. Mr. President, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory remains at the center of the conflagrations we are witnessing in various parts of the Middle East region. Except we are able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, peace in the region would remain elusive. Guyana continues to follow the alarming developments in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The combination of military operations by air, land, and sea in Gaza and the blockade of aid for more than 50 days continues to engender death, malnutrition, and severe hardships for the population in Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel's ongoing military operations continues to fuel large-scale displacement, destruction of property, and death and insecurity for civilians. Israel must bring its war in Gaza to an end and must cease its military operations in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The protection of civilians must be the foremost priority. Mr. President, we have listened with great concern to the Secretary General's account of the situation in Gaza today. Gaza is extremely dangerous for humanitarians carrying out life-saving work and for civilians who are trying to eke out an existence amidst the misery that completely encompasses them. Movement is dangerous for aid workers since deconfliction and coordination mechanisms are non-functional and access restrictions impede their operations. Further, with the aid blockade in effect since 2nd of March, vital supplies are running out. We noted with concern, for example, the announcement by the World Food Programme last Friday that it had run out of food stocks in Gaza. Further, we noted that hot meal kitchens in Gaza may soon run out of food. We are, in effect, watching as more and more Palestinians are condemned to die through starvation, bomb or bullet, or disease. And all of this in violation of unambiguous tenets of international law that prohibit such treatment of civilians. The Council must demand accountability for these egregious assaults on civilians in Gaza. Mr. President, the statistics coming out of the Gaza Strip should compel this Council to urgent action. Since 7th October 2023, more than 51,000 Palestinians have been killed and more than 116,000 injured. 418 workers, aid workers, including 295 UN staff, have been killed in Gaza. 210 Palestinian journalists and media workers have been killed. At least 1.9 million people, or about 90% of the population across Gaza, have been displaced, some of them 10 times or more. Indeed, since 18th of March, at least 20 displacement orders have been issued by the Israeli military, and over 2/3 of the Gaza Strip are considered no-go areas. These statistics paint a horrific picture of the circumstances to which Palestinians have been deliberately subject, and one is compelled to draw the same conclusion as OCHA did, that is, and I quote, deprivation by design, unquote. In the occupied West Bank, displacement is also on the rise. Civilians, including children, continue to be killed. Demolition of Palestinian-owned structures continued unabated, as do attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians. Guyana therefore reiterates the following 4 appeals. First, we call for an immediate return to the ceasefire, for the release of all remaining hostages from Gaza, and for urgent, unimpeded humanitarian access into Gaza. We also call for the UN agencies, including UNRWA, operating in the occupied Palestinian territory, to be given full facility to carry out their mandate. We have taken note of ongoing efforts to have the parties agree to return to the implementation of the ceasefire deal and call on Hamas and Israel to cooperate fully in line with Resolution 2735. Second, we call for the protection of civilians to be prioritized in accordance with international humanitarian law. Third, Guyana also calls for the protection of United Nations personnel, aid workers, and journalists operating in Gaza. Too many of these workers have been killed and injured as they attempt to bring relief to Palestinians or draw attention to their plight. Fourth and final, Guyana appeals for a return to negotiations towards the achievement of the two-state solution in keeping with relevant UN resolutions. We look forward to the high-level international conference in June and hope that there will be some concrete outcomes that can take us closer to that goal. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Guyana. I give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, the Middle East continues to face a series of complex and interconnected challenges. It is a region marked by striking dualities of perseverance and instability, but also of progress too often tempered by regression. In recent months, we welcome a new president and government in Lebanon and underlined the need for strengthening the Lebanese armed forces to help secure a permanent ceasefire and promote the state's authority in the country. We have celebrated the collapse of the brutal Assad regime in Syria. While Syria still faces many challenges, the appointment of a transitional government is commendable. Denmark continues to support the Syrian people and calls for an inclusive and Syrian-led political transition process in line with the principles of Resolution 2254. And we've seen a significant weakening of Hamas and Hezbollah throughout the region. These developments offer hope for a more stable and peaceful Middle East. In contrast, we are also observing a series of deeply concerning developments. In Gaza, the humanitarian situation is ever deteriorating, and the ceasefire has collapsed. No humanitarian aid has been allowed into Gaza for almost 2 months due to the complete humanitarian blockade imposed by Israel, cutting 2 million people from basic assistance. Water, electricity, and medical supplies are lacking. We are further alarmed by the recent reports that WPF has depleted all its food stocks in Gaza. Families in Gaza are reporting utter exhaustion from moving numerous times due to Israeli-issued evacuation orders. Mr. President, Israel has experienced extreme trauma following Hamas terrorist attack on October 7 and has the right to defend itself. We'll continue to condemn the brutal terrorist attacks and the ruthless hostage taken by Hamas. We will also continue to remind Israel that it must defend itself within the parameters of international law, including international humanitarian law. We condemn any attacks against humanitarian workers, medical staff, and healthcare facilities. They must be protected in accordance with the parties' obligations under international law. We watch the development in the West Bank with deep concern and urge Israel immediately to halt all settlement expansions on Palestinian land, address the settler violence, and stop the major displacement of civilians. These actions will not lead to more security and stability. They will only fuel the flames of resentment and violence as they undermine the prospects for a two-state solution, which remains the only viable road to a lasting and just peace. Mr. President, the people of the Middle East long for peace. They deserve to enjoy the fruits of stability. They deserve to coexist peacefully with their neighbors, and they deserve the directions from the Security Council on how this can be achieved. We view the following actions as some of the very first steps on a long road to lasting peace. First, violence must cease in Gaza. We need an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and an end to Israel's blockade of humanitarian aid going into Gaza. We further call on Israel to ensure that any arrangement for the delivery of humanitarian aid happens in full respect of the humanitarian principles. Second, in Lebanon and Syria, we have to safeguard the operational space of UNIFIL and UNDOF to allow them to fulfill their mandates. While we acknowledge Israel's legitimate security concerns, we remain concerned by the recent Israeli attacks in Syria with reported civilian casualties. Israel must withdraw from the areas of limitation and separation, and equally, Israel must withdraw from southern Lebanon and dismantle any physical obstacles to UNIFIL carrying out its mandate. Third, We need to work together to support reconstruction, recovery and reform throughout the region. Denmark supports the Arab Plan for Reconstruction of Gaza as a good basis and commend the initiative of France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with the upcoming conference on the implementation of the two-state solution. Mr. President, in closing, Denmark maintains its firm commitment to permanent peace in the Middle East through a two-state solution. Regional leadership, coupled with and supported by sustained international engagement, including through this Council, can make progress. Denmark will continue to engage with all parties towards achieving this aid. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important meeting. I would also like to thank Secretary General for his comprehensive briefing. Last week's announcement by the World Food Programme that existing food stocks have been depleted reminds us that the current 8-week blockade of Gaza by Israel cannot be justified. Humanitarian aid should never be wielded as a political tool, yet famine is once again looming for Palestinians in Gaza. We underscore the obligations to respect international humanitarian law. This includes the responsibility of the occupying power to ensure requisite food and medical supplies and to grant free passage of humanitarian relief into and throughout the occupied territory. We urge Israel to immediately allow and facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza by all relevant agencies, including UNRWA, fully respecting the principles of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality, and independence. The continued taking of hostages by Hamas is unacceptable. However, this does not lay the ground for Israel's non-compliance of international law. Mr. President, history will remember that the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza, which is particularly acute for its 1 million children. We call on all parties to comply with their obligations to protect civilians and humanitarian workers. We take serious note of the belated admittance by the IDF to the deadly attacks in March, killing Palestinian emergency relief workers and a UN staff member. Credible investigations are still needed, and all those responsible must be punished, and concrete measures to prevent recurrence should be established. In addition, we remain deeply concerned by the apocalyptic living conditions in Gaza due to massive destruction, expanding no-go zones, and the critically strained health system and shortages of basic services, to name just a few. Israel's military strikes on heavy equipment vehicles provided by mediating countries for reconstruction deprives Palestinian civilians of their desperate hope for early recovery. Mr. President, we all know that the best way to ensure compliance with international norms in Gaza is a ceasefire. The efforts by mediating countries are still going on. As such, we strongly urge parties to this conflict to reinvigorate sincere engagement to secure a renewed ceasefire. In this regard, we highlight the impassioned remarks by President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, demanding that Hamas release all Israeli hostages and criticizing their actions as inflicting damage to the Palestinian cause. We hope that his rare comments, by drawing a clear line between the PA and Hamas, will be a starting point for both Israel and Palestine to move in the right direction toward advancing the two-state solution. Mr. President, we also need urgent de-escalation and compliance with international law in the West Bank. Ongoing evacuation orders, demolition of homes, and movement restrictions, combined with the expansion of settlements and settlers' violence, are driving Palestinian families from their land. We are deeply concerned that in 2025 alone, Israeli authorities have advanced plans for over 15,000 settlement housing units. We reiterate that Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory constitute a flagrant violation under international law, as provided in Resolution 2334. We call on Israel to engage with regional players, including the Palestinian Authority, to enhance coexistence and peace. In this regard, we welcome the holding of the international conference in June, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. Mr. President, since the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7, we have witnessed multiple significant developments in the region, notably in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. While some of them are driving the region into deeper instability, we also witnessed a historic transition of Syria. Its government's will to cooperate with the international community is a beacon toward a better future for the region. We fully understand the central importance of a just and durable solution to the Palestinian question in the context of peace and stability in the wider region. As such, we hope that the ceasefire in Gaza can be swiftly renewed and the reconstruction process can be followed based on international law and free from demographic or territorial changes. In closing, Mr. President, we reiterate our strong condemnation and rejection of all forms of hatred, including anti-Semitism. Last week, Jews around the world marked Holocaust Remembrance Day. We hope that all peoples can learn from this historic crime and redouble efforts for tolerance, harmony, and respect. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the French presidency for convening this timely and critical debate. We are also grateful to the Secretary General for his sobering and candid briefing and his clear and urgent recommendations. We commend and salute the United Nations staff and humanitarian workers who are engaged in Gaza under difficult circumstances. Mr. President, the tragedy unfolding in Gaza is without precedent, both in scale and in humanity. This is not merely a humanitarian crisis. It is the systematic destruction of a people and the erasure of a nation's right to exist. Israel's attack on Al-Ahli Hospital earlier this month, the last major hospital providing critical health care, was a horrific massacre. The deliberate targeting of civilians and essential infrastructure, the use of starvation as a weapon, and the incineration of displaced families in tents. These are not collateral damages of war. They are methods of war. The occupying power's intent is unmistakable: to leave no space that is safe for Palestinians. These are acts of war crimes and ethnic cleansing. Israel's unilateral breach of the ceasefire agreement brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States was a deliberate choice of return to war over diplomacy. This assault on Gaza is killing civilians at 4 times the rate of previous conflicts. Since hostilities resumed, nearly 2,000 more Palestinians have been killed, adding to the staggering death toll of over 52,000, among them more than 17,000 children. For over 7 weeks, Gaza has been under total siege. Food, water, and medicine have been blocked, plunging over 2 million people into famine. The World Food Programme has warned that supplies are exhausted. The United Nations now states plainly, Gaza is not at risk of famine. It is experiencing one. Even humanitarian convoys are being attacked with impunity. There must be accountability for these crimes and blatant violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. In the West Bank, we witness a parallel crisis: forced displacement, relentless settlement expansion, and daily violence. Over 40,000 Palestinians have been uprooted, the largest such displacement since 1967. Meanwhile, Israel continues its illegal annexation and occupation in blatant defiance of international law. Equally alarming and illegal is Israel's deliberate carving up of Gaza, where Israeli army has turned over 30% of Gaza into a so-called security buffer zone. That is unlawful usurpation of Palestinian land under the barrel of the gun. The scope of impunity, Mr. President, does not stop at Gaza or the West Bank. Israel's pattern of illegal actions extends into Lebanon and Syria, violating ceasefires and Security Council resolutions alike. The pattern is clear. As long as the root cause, the illegal occupation of Palestinian and Arab lands, is ignored and not addressed, peace will remain an illusion. Mr. President, in the face of this gloom and devastation, the world must act. The status quo is untenable. What we need is not mere expressions of concern, not just ticking a box, as the Secretary General noted this morning, but decisive and collective action focused on three essential objectives. First, an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Without a ceasefire, there can be no protection of civilians, no humanitarian relief, no political process. Resolution 2735 must be fully and swiftly implemented. The ceasefire must extend to the West Bank, where violence is escalating. Every day of delay costs innocent lives, and the ceasefire must be permanent, because civilian lives on both sides cannot be negotiated in cycles of violence and destruction. Second, full and unhindered humanitarian access. The blockade of Gaza must be lifted now. Humanitarian access is not a concession to be granted, but a legal obligation. Aid workers, convoys, and medical teams must operate freely and safely. Starvation cannot be normalized as a weapon of war. Aid is not negotiable, as the Secretary General said. Collective punishment must end. The international community must mobilize massive and sustained assistance to prevent total famine and begin the process of recovery and rebuilding shattered lives. The Gaza reconstruction plan must be fully and actively supported, and there must be no forced displacement of Gazans from their land. Third, a clear political horizon grounded in Palestinian statehood. Humanitarian relief addresses the symptom. It's only justice that can cure the disease, which is the occupation. History has shown us that ending the violence without ending the occupation will only invite future cycles of conflict. The Palestinian people deserve a credible and irreversible political path forward towards a sovereign, independent, and contiguous and viable state of Palestine based on the 1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. In this context, the upcoming June conference on realization of the two-state solution, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, is a vital opportunity. It must deliver tangible outcomes, a timeline for Palestinian statehood, a freeze and reversal of settlement expansion, concrete measures to protect civilians and holy sites, and full, equal, and rightful membership of Palestine in the United Nations. Pakistan calls on the international community to ensure the success of this conference. Let us make it a turning point, not another missed opportunity. Mr. President, Foreign Minister, Pakistan firmly believes that sustainable peace in the Middle East cannot be built on the normalization of occupation. The world must come to terms with this reality. 75 years of failure have shown one immutable truth. Peace cannot coexist with occupation. Justice cannot thrive under apartheid. And stability cannot take root where millions remain stateless. The world knows what must be done, and I believe this Council itself knows what is the ultimate path to peace. Having endorsed the framework for pacific settlement of the Palestinian question in its various resolutions over the years, the only question that remains is whether there is the necessary will to do so. As echoed during yesterday's debate on refugees, there is an urgent imperative to address the root causes of conflicts. Around this table, there was a unanimous call yesterday for the Council to do more, not only to respond to crises, but to prevent them and to promote peaceful, just, and lasting settlements of ongoing and protracted conflicts, particularly those involving foreign occupation. Let us work together to realize that objective and to uphold the promise of the UN Charter and international law for all peoples. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of Pakistan and now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the French presidency for convening this high-level meeting that enables us to break the deafening silence surrounding, in this council, the Palestinian question, as if it were a foregone conclusion. This meeting perhaps will be a welcome break, a break from the oppressive silence of this council, this unacceptable inertia from this council for more than a year now in the face of the Palestinian tragedy. I just want to cite two figures. Over the past 2 months, we have seen the death of 2,273 Palestinians and almost 6,000 injured.
President, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Secretary General for his briefing and for his tireless efforts to ease the suffering of the Palestinian people and to bring an end to the relentless Israeli aggression against a defenseless civilian population. These efforts, while deeply appreciated, have regrettably not shaken the intransigence of the Israeli occupying power, which remains determined to pursue its ongoing deadly campaign, a campaign of genocide, a campaign of ethnic cleansing, a campaign of collective punishment, and of systematic destruction of Palestinian life and livelihood. Worse still, the international community and this very Security Council failed to extend the level of support required to make this effort impactful. The absence of collective action, the lack of accountability, and the double standards have emboldened the Israeli occupier to act with total impunity, total immunity. Today, we find ourselves at a critical juncture, and we must ask ourselves, when will our word be translated into action? When will the resolution of this very Security Council be finally enforced? When will international law cease to be a tool selectively applied? When will the dignity, the rights, humanity of the Palestinian people finally be respected? Mr. President, for over 18 months, the people of Palestine, particularly in Gaza, have endured unspeakable horrors, mass killings, mass starvation, mass displacement, and mass destruction. Abandoned and defenseless, the Palestinian people face one of the most ruthless occupying forces in the world. The international community failure to uphold its moral and legal responsibilities have emboldened Israel to normalize and even promote the crime of mass deportation as a strategy. Let us be clear. This is not a war. This is organized, systematic annihilation. Despite the horrific figures well known to everyone, some still refuse to see the reality and to condemn the indiscriminate attacks on the Palestinian people. The reality is blatantly reflected in reports from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which confirm that 36 recent Israeli attacks, all those killed were women and children. Yes, all of them. This pattern points to either indiscriminate bombing or the deliberate targeting of civilians. What justification can possibly explain these atrocities? What new narrative will the Israeli occupying power spin? That every tent bombed was a Hamas center for command? A Hamas center for command? That every child buried alive was a threat? The deliberate targeting of Palestinian civilians under the direction of the highest political and military Israeli authorities is evident. It is well documented. This is not collateral damage. It is a policy. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity, and they necessitate accountability and justice. Mr. President, international humanitarian organization confirmed that Gaza is experiencing now the worst humanitarian catastrophe since October 2023. This is one of the worst humanitarian failures of our generation, of the international community. Every single person in Gaza is now relying on humanitarian aid to survive. And that lifeline has been completely cut off since a blockade of all aid supplies was imposed by the Israeli authorities for almost 2 months. The World Food Programme has declared that its food stocks in Gaza are now fully exhausted. But the Israelis' Minister of Defense shamelessly declared that, and I quote, blocking humanitarian aid is an intentional tactic, one of the Israel's pressure tools on Hamas. What kind of world are we living in when the use of starvation as weapon of war is publicly promoted, publicly assumed, and they suffer no consequences? Israeli occupying forces are not fighting a war. They are trying to erase people. We, in the Security Council, we should impose an immediate ceasefire before it is too late. Mr. President, situation in West Bank is not less alarming. Settlement expansion continues at a record pace, with entire communities uprooted, armed settler militias protected and empowered by the Israeli authorities roam freely, attacking Palestinians' families, burning homes, destroying fields and places of worship. And Palestinians are being forcibly displaced in broad light. Sacred sites, including Al-Aqsa Mosque, are regularly stormed by extremist settlers, accompanied and protected by Israeli police. Entire neighborhoods are now being turned into military zones. Arbitrary arrests, home demolition, and daily raids have become grim routine in the West Bank. In Jenin, in Nablus, in Khalil, and Tulkarem, Palestinian lives are under constant threat. This is a strategy of domination, a strategy of fragmentation, a strategy of humiliation. The Israeli occupation is trying to suffocate the Palestinian presence, to diminish their dignity, to erase their identity, and finally, ultimately, to rewrite history of Palestine. Today, the notion of a Palestinian state feels more like a fading illusion. But, Mr. President, despite of occupation, despite waves of dispossession, and despite the immense suffering they endure, the Palestinian people have never surrendered. They continue to cling to their homeland, to their culture, and to their legitimate aspiration. They have learned from history that exile is not a solution, that justice denied is not justice lost, and that liberation may be delayed, but it is inevitable. With the support of the international community and through steadfast resilience, the Palestinian people will achieve their inalienable right to self-determination. They will establish their independent and sovereign state with Al-Quds Sharif as its eternal capital. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant permanent de l'aide.
I thank the permanent representative of Algeria for that statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Je remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. On behalf of the government of Panama, we'd like to express our acknowledgement to France for the way in which they have steered the Council this month and for convening this open debate on the situation in the Middle East. We'd also like to greet and thank His Excellency Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary-General, for his valuable briefing, as well as his constant commitment to promoting international peace and security. We also welcome the participation of all delegations who will today contribute with their reflections to strengthening multilateral dialogue on this topic. President, Panama remains convinced that it's possible to build a Middle East based on mutual respect, tolerance, and human dignity. However, today, this potential is limited by a reality that is affected by many crises that are superimposed upon each other: prolonged conflict without a political solution, persistent humanitarian emergencies, essential services that have collapsed, and fragile security environments. This is in addition to cross-cutting threats such as terrorism and violent extremism. This complex combination of factors has significantly reduced spaces for understanding, and it makes a consistent and robust international response more urgent than ever. The war in Gaza, unleashed by the attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, which Panama firmly condemns, has led to one of the most serious humanitarian crises in the recent history of the region. More than 51,000 deaths, 116,000 injured, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, widespread displacement, and extremely precarious conditions in which thousands of Palestinian families are surviving, reflects an alarming level of suffering. Panama reiterates its call for there to be an immediate, sustained ceasefire to eliminate the humanitarian tragedy, and there must be full, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. This measure can establish the conditions for there to be a lasting political solution. A critical measure is for the 59 people who remain as hostages to be immediately, unconditionally, and safely released. Panama reiterates its solidarity with the families of those people, and they are in suffering and uncertainty at the moment. A political solution to be legitimate and sustainable must include a transition process that excludes extremist actors such as Hamas and makes it possible to rebuild governance in Gaza, focused on protecting civilians and allowing them to fully exercise their rights. Similarly, protection of humanitarian workers who are risking their lives to protect others must be guaranteed by all and at all times. Panama pays tributes to the hundreds of humanitarian workers who have lost their lives in this conflict. We recognize the commitment of the UN agencies' staff and the staff of NGOs who are operating in extremely difficult conditions to save lives. Their work, as well as the integrity of humanitarian facilities, must be respected and protected by all parties. President, in the West Bank, the situation continues to deteriorate. Recent reports have raised alarms about an environment marked by forced displacement, demolition of houses, restrictions on movement, and an increase in violence. Panama reiterates that any measure on the ground must respect international law, including international humanitarian law, and the relevant resolutions of this Council. We acknowledge the diplomatic efforts geared towards facilitating an effective mediation between the parties, and we encourage them to be strengthened with the support of the United Nations, so as to guarantee that both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security within the internationally recognized borders. The impacts of the conflict in Gaza and the West Bank have intensified the dynamics of confrontation on different fronts in the Middle East. In the south of Lebanon, clashes have led to victims, widespread displacement, and essential infrastructure has been damaged. In spite of the ceasefire that was agreed upon in November last year, there have been constant violations of the truce. Panama takes note of the recent efforts undertaken by the government of Lebanon to contain irregular activities on its territory, including the detention of persons alleged to be linked to launching projectiles towards Israel. In Syria, the situation in the zone of separation remains weak. The skirmishes and violations of the 1974 separation agreement threaten the security of local populations and international staff who are deployed there. The establishment of the new government in Syria in March opens a window of opportunity to move towards an inclusive process which is Syrian-led, in line with the spirit of Resolution 2254. We welcome the agreement reached with Kurdish representatives for the institutional integration in the northeast of the country and the first steps towards a new constitution. We hope that this progress will consolidate with the support of the UN and with a staunch commitment to diversity, justice, and the human rights for all. We support the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity both of Lebanon and Syria. These are fundamental principles which are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. We're also strong supporters of the work of UNIFIL and UNDOF. These missions are critical to preserve stability, to avoid any further escalation, and to facilitate conditions for dialogue. Their freedom of movement and security must be guaranteed, strictly adhering to their respective mandates. On a different tack, Yemen is a critical area where regional tensions are ratcheting up. Last year, attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea intensified in hostility and led to devastating collateral impacts on civilians. This has meant that more than two-thirds of the people of Yemen are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. We once again stress the need for the humanitarian personnel detained by the Houthis to be immediately released, and diplomatic efforts to reach a cessation of hostilities and a sustainable political solution need to resume without further delay. We once again condemn the attacks against civilian vessels which affect international maritime security, which interrupt supply chains and make it more difficult for humanitarian aid to be delivered. President, against the current backdrop, terrorism, religious fundamentalism, and the presence of foreign fighters have all taken on a more complex, dynamic, transnational nature. We think that these threats require a comprehensive response, combining prevention, social cohesion, and institutional strengthening. The Security Council must beef up its ability to preempt and understand the new forms of violence, or that, although they may be different in their form, all erode international peace and security with equal seriousness. We're also concerned by the lack of concrete progress towards the establishment of a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, in line with what was agreed at the 1995 review conference of the NPT. In times of increasing mistrust and structural tensions, the commitments to the multilateral non-proliferation mechanisms must urgently be renewed. We need to see diplomatic negotiations on arms control resumed with the requisite seriousness and political will. This has to be guided by the principles of international law, multilateralism, and the common interest to preserve peace. President, the suffering that entire communities in the Middle East have borne for decades is not just as a result of the cruelty of conflicts, but also the prolonged absence of political will to address its structural causes. Many resolutions have been adopted by this Council, but in many cases there is a lack of constructive political will, which leads to them being translated into concrete measures to be implemented and to respect the agreements and to reach genuine solutions. This inertia leaves dangerous vacuums which allow extremism, hatred, and the prevalence of sexual violence to proliferate, and this disproportionately affects women and girls. Given this reality, we reiterate that multilateralism is the only way to recover trust, to protect civilians, and to move towards sustainable solutions guided by international law and shared responsibility. That is why we think it is critical to promote initiatives that can strengthen the collective ability for prevention and to come up with an appropriate response. We particularly need to strengthen the United Nations and its specialized agencies' abilities to document, prevent, and address humanitarian emergencies under the principles of impartiality, transparency, and respect for the norms of international law, and this includes international humanitarian law. We also need to support national reconciliation led by local actors with international technical support, recognizing the diversity of societies and ensuring the full, effective, safe, and meaningful participation of women as the way to build lasting peace. We also need to bolster cooperation between agencies of the UN system and regional mechanisms such as the League of Arab States to improve humanitarian coordination and to promote inclusive political solutions. President, in conclusion, behind every conflict that we address in this Council, there are lives that have been silenced and they deserve to be recognized. We're talking about mothers who are hoping to see their children again while they have been buried under rubble, or trapped in dark tunnels without knowing if they're going to be able to see them again. Children who, if they ever are able to go back to school, will no longer find their playmates again because they were victims of violence, because they spoke a different language, because they professed a different faith, or because they belonged to a different ethnic minority. Panama believes that lasting peace in the Middle East will not be reached through military force or extremism, but rather through commitment to legitimate, inclusive, and sustainable political processes. The people of the Middle East deserve more than just truces. They deserve lasting peace, and it is our duty to make this possible. Thank you. The President, I thank the representative of Panama, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank the UN Secretary General for his review of the situation in the region. For a year and a half now, the collective punishment of the entire Palestinian people, both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, has been ongoing. With the resumption on the 2nd of March of large-scale military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, in the Strip, the toll of those killed on a daily basis and injured is now in the hundreds. About 500,000 Gazans have become IDPs over the past month. The overall number of those who've died since the start of the escalation in the area of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is more than 52,000, and 118,000 have been injured. A large number of those killed in Gaza have been women and children, and there are regular attacks on schools and medical and civilian facilities. An especially egregious incident was the cold-blooded murder by IDF soldiers at the end of March of 15 humanitarian workers, including UN staff, and 8 medics of the Palestinian Red Crescent. We've seen from the results of the Israeli investigation that it was an operational misunderstanding between the soldiers. However, when attempting to justify the actions of their soldiers, the Israeli leadership initially assured the entire international community that the flashing lights on the ambulances were switched off. This was proven by the video recording from the phone of one of the doctors who were killed not to be true. So what is the cost of the lives of 15 humanitarian workers, the firing of the deputy unit commander, and disciplinary measures for the other officer? It's hardly surprising that with such mild punishment, and in essence a lack of due accountability, Gaza has long broken all records in the number of those killed, be these children, humanitarian workers, UN staff, UNRWA workers, and journalists. We'd like to recall that the protection of humanitarian staff is an unconditional prerequisite and an obligation in line with IHL. Mr. President, the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip is worsened by the almost 60-day blockade of the provision of food and medication, which has led to supplies running out. This is despite the fact that 3,000 UNRWA trucks with humanitarian assistance are ready to enter the Strip. Humanitarian organizations are warning about an impending famine, particularly amongst children. We mustn't forget that these actions of Israel are directly impacting the detention conditions of the hostages in the Strip. It is totally unacceptable to use humanitarian assistance as a bargaining chip in negotiations. The situation is artificially exacerbated by Israel's ban on UNRWA's work. This structure plays a key, irreplaceable role in conducting humanitarian operations on the ground and providing comprehensive assistance to Palestinians. Undermining the work of UNRWA is complicating an already difficult situation for the inhabitants of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. We would urge Israel to reconsider its decision to cease cooperation with UNRWA. We'd also like to remind you that the agency's role is to assist Palestinians until a Palestinian state is established. There's no justification for the attempts by West Jerusalem to justify the drive to annex the Strip by using Hamas's refusal to unconditionally release the hostages. The recent statement of the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, to maintain military control over Gaza and to prevent establishing a Palestinian administration there is also along the same lines. Essentially, we're talking about a de facto rejection of this two-state model for a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the dismantling of the international legal bases for the Middle East settlement. And this is something that the Secretary-General pointed out today. Something that is part of this logic is the ongoing West Bank Iron Wall operation covering Jenin, Tulkram, and a number of other communities. From the 7th of October 2023, about 16,000 Palestinians have been detained. The number of Palestinians who fled their homes in the West Bank is unprecedented since 1967. There's ongoing record settlement building from December 2024 to the middle of March 2025. 10,600 housing units have been built or approved in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and there's been retroactive authorization of 13 blocks, and 850 new checkpoints have been set up. This de facto draws a line under the possibility of establishing a viable territorially contiguous Palestinian state. Mr. Minister, against this extremely pessimistic picture, there was a glimmer of hope in the words of the Prime Minister of Qatar regarding a degree of progress in negotiations between Israel and Hamas on a ceasefire. A renewed agreement would continue the work to stabilize the humanitarian situation in Gaza and to return IDPs, who now number millions, and to rebuild the Strip. This is the only chance to reunite those Israeli hostages who are still in the Strip with their families. I'd like to remind you that a large number of them were released precisely during a ceasefire and not during military operations. I'd like to confirm our fundamental, unwavering support in favour of a swift and unconditional ceasefire and the release of all forcibly detained persons, the provision of safe and unhindered access, and the relaunch of the peace process on a two-state solution basis that would ensure the realization of the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. The ultimate aim here is to establish an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as the capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. A solution to the Palestinian problem is the key to stabilization in the entire Middle East, banking on force and establishing buffer zones that we've seen not only in the OPT but also in southern Lebanon and in Syria. This will not lead to establishing a long-term, lasting peace in the region, but rather to a freezing of the conflict potential for decades to come and a guarantee of outbreaks in the future. Properly taking into consideration and respecting the interests of countries in the region and promoting diplomacy and negotiations alone can help to overcome this dangerous trend and break the vicious cycle of violence. We are prepared to support any efforts of the UN Security Council to return to a peaceful settlement in the area of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. A particular role here should be played by the Arab group, whose position regarding possible practical steps from the Council is one we unfailingly are guided by. We are prepared to work with all parties sharing our desire to achieve a fair, long-term and lasting peace in the entire Middle East. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Sayyid al-Rais.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, Member of the Security Council, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Syria is not an island isolated from its environment, but is an integral part of the region's fabric. Our stability, our security cannot be separated from the security, stability, and prosperity of our neighbors. Violence and turbulences in any country do not stop at that country's borders. They transcend them to spread instability and create waves of displacement and extremism everywhere. We reject any force or any policy that threatens peace or endanger the lives and livelihood of people in our region. Since our liberation on the 8th of December 2024, The Syrian people had proved what can be achieved through national will and popular unity, even when the doors of international justice are closed. We have faced for 14 years systematic killing, systematic torture, and repression that continued for more than half a century. When this council failed to act, and there were several cases of vetoes that prevented the delivery of life-saving assistance, the Syrians decided to take their destiny into their own hands. We created an interim government that encompasses individuals who are highly competent and representatives of all the components of the Syrian society. This government has garnered recently unanimous support from the UN Human Rights Council. Mr. President, we have succeeded in unifying the former military factions despite the tremendous challenges within the framework of a common constitutional declaration and a genuine reform program. In the first national inclusive dialogue of its kind, more than 1,000 Syrians gathered to discuss the most prominent issues that affect the future of our country. We will soon launch a commission for transitional justice and an independent commission for the fate of the missing, in line also and in addition to our partnership with the OPCW to identify and destroy the remaining arsenal of the previous regime. We are also collaborating with the IIIM and other organizations concerned with justice to document the crimes and find the best ways to achieve justice and accountability and prevent recurrence of violations. Mr. President, these steps have a year ago were thought to be impossible. Yet today they are a reality. And despite that, our national work is subjected to real threat in the form of the Israeli repeated airstrikes that violate our space and our sovereignty. The pretexts that were used to justify such strikes in terms of the armed groups supported externally does not stand anymore. These strikes are not only a blatant violation of Security Council resolutions, particularly Resolution 242 and 497, but also destroy our civilian infrastructure and opens the space for chaos again and the return of militias against whom Syrians had fought for 14 years. All the narrative, the misleading narrative by the Israeli side had failed. The Syrian people feel concerned and feel threatened by the Israeli side as a result of the ongoing strikes and the indiscriminate bombing and the incursions. This forces people to displacement and to leave their villages that are along the borders in the southern of Syria. Several people were killed, were injured as a result of this aggression. This expansionist approach and over-inflating of the dangers and the non-respect of the sovereignty of the neighbors would lead to instability and violence in the region. Israeli practices against Syria will encourage and will find that the environment that is conducive for those groups affiliated with Iran to destabilize Syria. Not taking decisive decisions to deploy troops in the buffer zone will undermine the international will and will make the people in Syria lose their trust. We met several times with UNDOF, who feel desperate and feel incapable as a result of Israel's blocking of their missions as mandated by this council. Mr. President, Christians and Kurds and Alawites, as well as the Druze and Arabs, agree fully that we will not accept any foreign interference in our country and reject the Israeli practices. They refuse to be used in the media campaigns of Israel that seek to divide Syria and keep it fragile and unstable. Even Syrian Jews, who we've met repeatedly, reject such plans and such policies. Mr. President, If we are able to give convincing and genuine responses to these questions, then we can understand who destabilizes the situation in Syria and who builds peace, who removed the Assad regime and the militias affiliated with that regime, and who violates the airspace and strikes the different sites and carries incursions into our lands, who recognizes the diversity of the Syrian society, and those who use them in their rhetoric to enhance and to increase sectarianism, who enable the work of UNDOF and who obstructs it, who facilitates the work of OPCW in inspecting the sites of possible sites of chemical weapons, and who are bombing these sites. We remind this Council that the Golan is, after 50 years of its illegal annexation, continues to be under occupation in a blatant violation of the principles of the UN Charter. We call again for the implementation, the full implementation of Resolution 497 and enable UNDOF to restore the lines of the pre-4th of June 1967 lines. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand with the Palestinian people in Gaza who are still suffering from the brutal war, where continuous airstrikes and a blockade that is stifling, and deliberate starvation and targeting of paramedics and journalists, a demolition of homes, and repeated violation of fragile truces. These violations do not cause a humanitarian catastrophe or tragedy alone, but also feed into a cycle of instability in the region as a whole. From this platform, we would like to call for an immediate ceasefire to protect the civilians and ensure unobstructed access and delivery of humanitarian aid. Mr. President, within our borders, we worked seriously on dismantling Coptagon networks that threatened the communities in neighboring countries. We started to rebuild the roads, the ports, and the railways to enable trade and trade integration. Our objective is clear: to transfer those areas devastated by war to economic corridors that are of benefit to all countries in the region. The return of refugees is also crucial in our recovery efforts. Syria, before anything, will be built by its citizens. But the Syrians will not return to the debris or to an environment that is stifled by sanctions. The restrictions imposed on Syria that were imposed as a response to the violence of the previous regime are now punishing the victims of that regime and prevent them from accessing materials, financing, and necessary services for reconstruction. Therefore, we call upon this Council and the international community as a whole to lift these sanctions and enable Syrians abroad to return in a dignified and voluntary and safe manner. Mr. President, genuine peace cannot be built behind walls and cannot be protected within closed borders. Our security is not separate from the security of our neighbors, and no country can guarantee the safety of its people while threatening the sovereignty of other people. This Council has a historic responsibility and a real opportunity to support the recovery of Syria and the stability of the region as a whole. We call that you support mechanisms that achieve and realize justice for all victims, and we call upon you to develop a clear, coordinated joint vision for reconstruction and opening trade corridors and guarantee a safe and dignified return for the refugees. Let's replace vetoes with wisdom, strikes with dialogue and meetings, sanctions with support and joint solidarity. Only then every citizen in Damascus, Ramallah, Quneitra, and Gaza would live in peace, in dignity and hope. Thank you, Mr. President.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Al-Shibet.
Thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Nuno Sampaio, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Portugal.
Mr. President, Excellencies, let me start by strongly welcoming France's decision to elevate this open debate to ministerial level. The situation in Gaza continues to deserve our full attention and our best endeavors to put an end to the war, to stop civilian casualties, and to see the unconditional release of all hostages, and to resume full and independent humanitarian access and deliverance. On Lebanon, we must continue our support to the new government in its aim to strengthening state institutions. In this vein, it is critical to fully implement the terms of the 27 November 2024 ceasefire agreement and Security Council Resolution 1701. Regarding Syria, we stress the importance of a peaceful and inclusive political transition, protecting all Syrians, regardless of ethnicity or religious background, in line with the principles of the Resolution 2254, and free from harmful foreign interference. Challenges are massive, namely on the humanitarian and economic fronts. Therefore, Portugal announced recently another financial contribution to Syria during the 9th Brussels Donors Conference. Both Lebanese and Syrian peoples deserve peace and full respect for their country's territorial integrity, unity, and sovereignty. Mr. President, concerning Gaza, a return to the ceasefire is the most urgent priority, hand in hand with the resumption of the humanitarian aid without impediments. The current situation in Gaza and in the West Bank has a spillover effect for all the Middle East. Ending the war in Gaza is our pressing priority. We underline the terrible humanitarian conditions people are facing in the Gaza Strip, which are worse than ever and increasingly desperate. We strongly regret the failure to secure the necessary transition to the second phase of the ceasefire as agreed open between the parties. Portugal calls for the immediate halt on all hostilities and the resumption of negotiations to implement the second phase of the agreed ceasefire. We greatly value and fully support the mediators' efforts, namely Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, in facilitating negotiations. The mediator's role is crucial when tensions and radicalization threaten to hijack a political and peaceful solution to the conflict. Mr. President, the collective political commitment to resolve the Palestinian question based on the two-state solution is yet to be materialized. The right of self-determination by the Palestinian people remains an urgent common goal. We commend France and Saudi Arabia for organizing a high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, which will be held in June. This conference allows us a valuable window of opportunity, which merits our full commitment towards its success. Portugal stands ready to work with the co-sponsors and contribute to the two-state solution, which we fully support, and as the only viable long-term solution for peace in the region and to the end the conflict. There is no plan B. To enable a serious discussion on the two-state solution, we must have a ceasefire and the duly empowered Palestinian Authority, allowing for its further political contribution towards a peaceful political solution to the conflict, namely through its role on the ground as a factor of stabilization. Furthermore, UNRWA remains irreplaceable with a key role in ensuring stability on the ground. We welcome the recent appointment of Mr. Jan Martin as head of the strategic assessment of the agency. The international community must continue its efforts to safeguard actors such as UNRWA and the PA, which remain firm in their commitment to a peaceful solution to end this conflict. Mr. President, in conclusion, without a political process, there will be no peace in the region. Therefore, we reiterate our call to all parties to step up their efforts to reach an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Portugal remains committed with the rule of law and with an international order based on rules, with the United Nations at its core. We will maintain the consistency of our positions on every front and shall continue to strive for a just and peaceful solution to the Palestinian question, anchored on the relevant resolutions of the UN. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sampaio for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Charles Jose, Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and International Economic Relations of the Philippines.
Mr. President, I would like to thank you and the Republic of France for convening today's open debate. I also extend our appreciation to the Secretary General for his valuable briefing to the Council. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned that despite recent ceasefire agreement reached in January 2025, we find ourselves once again facing escalating violence in the region. The situation in the Middle East, particularly the Israel-Palestine conflict, continues to cause immense suffering and instability. The Philippines remains deeply concerned by the ongoing violence and tragic loss of civilian lives. We call for the immediate restoration of the ceasefire, unconditional release of all hostages, and the facilitation of full humanitarian access to those in need. It is essential that international humanitarian law is fully respected, ensuring the protection of civilians and humanitarian personnel. Humanitarian and aid workers working under increasingly dangerous circumstances must be afforded the protection they are entitled to under international law. It is time to end the cycle of violence, to protect civilians, ensure the flow of life-saving aid, and restore the ceasefire. The Philippines continues to emphasize its firm support for a two-state solution with a safe and independent Palestine and a secure Israel living in peace and harmony. We firmly believe that this solution remains to be the most viable and sustainable pathway to resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict, essential to the realization of a lasting peace. In this regard, we look forward to the upcoming high-level international conference on the international support to the implementation of the two-state solution on the question of Palestine to be held in June 2025. We also support the ongoing work of the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution. We see the conference and the Global Alliance as complementary and important opportunities to reinvigorate the international community's commitment to the two-state solution, particularly at a time when the political landscape requires renewed support and constructive dialogue. In his speech at the General Assembly in September 2024, Philippine Secretary of Foreign Affairs Enrique A. Manalo said, "The UN has set itself as the platform and pathway to address international peace and security. It serves as the ground for states to find convergence amidst crisis and conflict. It offers response and relief, hope and humanity. It is through this very platform here in this Security Council that we must strengthen our collective response to the crisis, offering not only relief but also hope and humanity to the people of the Middle East. The time to act is now. The only path to peace in the Middle East is through dialogue, respect for international law, and a commitment to human dignity for all." Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Jose from the Philippines Foreign Ministry, the Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Mishtina Renata Halheim, Deputy Minister for Development of Norway.
The situation in Palestine is catastrophic. Civilians in Gaza face an acute risk of starvation, disease, and death. 18,000 children have reportedly been killed. We are extremely concerned about the lack of access to critical aid and basic goods in Gaza. It is unacceptable that Israel has fully blocked humanitarian assistance to the area for more than 8 weeks. Israel has an obligation under international law to provide or otherwise allow access to life-saving assistance for the civilian population and ensure that humanitarian principles are upheld. Later this week, Norway will participate in a hearing in the advisory proceedings before the International Court of Justice on this very topic. There, we will set out our view on these fundamental legal obligations incumbent upon Israel. We condemn all attacks on humanitarian workers. It is crucial that those who risk their lives to save others and to carry out humanitarian work are protected. Those responsible must be held to account. We extend our deepest condolences and express our strong support to the bereaved and the organizations affected. President, we repeat our clear message. Fighting must stop immediately. The ceasefire must be resumed. The population must immediately have access to the emergency aid to which they are entitled. The hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. We mourn with all the victims and all the bereaved families. The future of Gaza must be shaped by Palestinians and serve the interests of its people. We welcome the Arab Reconstruction Plan. Until a two-state solution is achieved, we, the international community, have a responsibility to secure the rights of Palestine refugees. We, the member states, have equipped UNRWA with a UN mandate to do so. The agency is doing its best under extreme circumstances. If UNRWA is prevented from implementing its mandate, it will have serious ramifications also beyond the Middle East. President, we continue to be deeply concerned about increased tensions elsewhere in Palestine. Military operations in refugee camps, forced displacements and movement restrictions are worsening an already volatile situations in the West Bank. Settler violence continues. Between 15 and 21st of April, the UN documented at least 23 attacks by Israel settlers against Palestinians. This must stop. As has been underscored in this Council again and again, reaching a sustainable two-state solution is a prerequisite for peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. Norway remains committed. Let us use the upcoming UN conference in June, as well as the work of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution and the AHLC to intensify our efforts towards that end. President, it is critical that the transition in Syria succeeds for the Syrian people and for the stability and security of the Middle East and beyond. We must now give the transitional authorities the opportunity to ensure an inclusive government for all Syrians. Sanctions must be lifted to allow economic recovery and development. The Syrian population has endured hardship for decades, and the humanitarian needs are still high. Norway will continue to support the country's most vulnerable and insist in finding solutions that will promote self-reliance. Syrians must be allowed to determine their own future. The unity and the territorial integrity of Syria must be respected. For this, the international community should act in concert. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency for her statement. There are still a large number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. today. The meeting is suspended. It is so decided.